Hello, this is going to be another Unwise Sewing adventure, not nearly as complex as the previous one. Basically, I want to turn this fabric that I've had forever, and I don't have much of, into a simple little skirt. It will just be basically sewn into a tube with elastic on the top. However, I'm not sure you can tell how sheer it is. So I will be adding the complication of lining it with this that I thrifted a few years ago. It's Spandex E. So I think it should work. We'll find out. The first thing I have to consider about this is that there is a flaw at the center where there is a noticeable gap between the rows of foil dots. So I don't want that gap visible on the final garment, so I will be cutting it apart there and then eventually sewing it back together to make a side seam. Oh, and there is this area on this end where there are a lot of missing dots. I will make that the bottom, so hopefully those missing dot areas will be hidden in the hem. So I'm going to mark those missing dot areas with a heavy safety pin just so I can keep track of where it is more easily as the project progresses. Now I am lining up the edges that don't have dots on it, and I'm going to cut that off, leaving a seam allowance outside the dots so I can get as much width as possible out of this. And I've got to fold it up because if not, it's going to just slide right off. I leave as much width as possible in this fabric without exposing the area that doesn't have dots on the side. That makes sense? I think it made sense. I haven't measured anything. I am just eyeballing this as what looks like about 2 rows of dots worth, because that's what I plan to sew on the other edge. And yeah, I mentioned this is Unwise, right? Because this is Unwise. So, the lining. Yeah, as slippery as the other fabric was to work with, this is just, there's so much more of it and it's so heavier. Oh, and it still even has the original price tags on it. Sprouse! An exclamation point. Anyway, this is so heavy and so slippery that it's going to want to slide off of my work surface. It has more stretch up and down and side to side, but I'm going to still use it, the side to side stretch as it is, because I don't need it to have the heavy stretch. I just need it to stretch as much as the shell fabric, the Confetti has. So I decided to use the iron as a weight to hold the fabric in place to keep it from sliding, and that is the only way the iron is getting involved with this whole project. Right now I am fiddling with laying out the pieces I cut earlier so I can use them to cut out the lining. And I actually edited out about 2 minutes of fiddling with this fabric to get it flat. And of course, you can see I am using scissors as pattern weights, and I'm also, this edge turned out not to be cut evenly, so I'm trimming off uneven bits on this edge as well. Now I need to cut the waistband. Spoiler alert, I will actually cut another waistband later, because when I cut this one, I was thinking I would cut it at the finished waist size, and then after I started sewing, fortunately before I got to sewing on the waistband, I realized that I should be cutting it at the finished skirt size and then just using elastic to draw it in instead of making it waist size to begin with. But you can see the process of using a dull rotary cutter and a 2-inch wide see-through ruler to cut the waistband. So I also realized that my original idea to hem the lining separately from the shell, I actually can eliminate the need to deal with hemming at all if I just sew the lining directly to the shell at the bottom. But to do that, I need to make the lining shorter so it forces the shell to fold up nicely. So that's what I am getting ready to cut here. And as you can see, this fabric is frightening me a little bit because it is so heavy and slippery. So I'm going to refer to that area missing the dots for how much I should cut off of the lining to force it to make the exterior shell fabric fold up and hopefully hide all of those missing dots. But, you know, it turns out, I will also tell you, spoiler alert, there's still a few areas where there are dots missing. That's fine. It's vintage fabric. I think it just gives the whole thing a vintage look overall. At least I keep telling myself that. So here I am once again using my dull rotary cutter to try to cut through this heavy knit. And actually here I just ended up cutting it enough to give me a cutting line to use scissors. I really need a new rotary cutter blade. Alright, time to sew. I have a ballpoint needle on my machine. If you don't know, you are supposed to use ballpoint needles for knits, because if you use a standard sharp needle, there is a risk that you could accidentally cut through one of the tiny little yarns that makes up the knit with that sharp needle. And then this could also potentially lead to the fabric unraveling when you put it on, because there is tension at that seam line, and that seam line would be where the tiny little yarns had accidentally been cut, and you don't want your clothes unraveling. So if you use a ballpoint needle, it will gently push aside the yarns instead of cutting through them, potentially. I mean, you can use a sharp needle on knits and never have this problem, but a ballpoint needle will guarantee that you don't have this problem. And I just used the dots themselves as the guide for how deep my seam allowance should be. Trying to sew between them, because if you sew through confetti dot, you could end up with the adhesive gumming up your needle, which is something else I wanted to avoid. Now I used the magnetic seam gauge at about 1/2 inch for sewing the seams on the lining fabric, because there are no convenient dot grids to guide me, but the thing about the seam gauge is you just set it in place and go. So I'm taking out that heavy pin that I used to mark where the missing dots were, and I am pinning the bottom edge there right side together to the lining. It took me a probably embarrassing amount of time to realize that I needed to turn one of these things inside out to make this sewing easier. I mean, I don't have to. I could have just pinned them and sewn them flat, but it is easier when you turn them inside out. And I only pinned at the side seams, which, also spoiler alert, led to some issues later. I said, I'm good at sewing, this does not mean I don't make mistakes. Okay, I set my machine to a zigzag. Oh, I still have my straight stitch foot in, so it's not a wide zigzag, but it's enough of a zigzag so that when I walk in this skirt, it stretches just a little bit at that seam instead of popping it apart. So I am using the seam guide magnetic depth thingy again, just because that is easier than trying to follow the gaps between the rows of dots. And I am stretching all layers as I sew and fighting with this edge curling over, and I don't know why it did not occur to me to just stop and pin it down, but it didn't, and I fought with it. And I was trying to make this a fast project, but I think it would have been faster if I had actually just taken the time to pin it instead of fight to get it flat like you just saw me doing. And am doing again. And then I got to an issue where I hadn't stretched things enough, and so the shell fabric actually was not lining up with the lining fabric by the time I was almost finished sewing them together, so I had to take out some stitches. Something I'm not sure that people new to sewing realize is that being good at sewing does not involve never making mistakes. It involves knowing how to deal with your mistakes. So I have gotten pretty good at taking stitches out, and there are a lot of ways to do that, and in this one I realized that since this fabric is so slippery, the thread was just sliding right out. So I pulled the thread near where I wanted to start sewing again, clipped that, and then just grabbed the thread tail and pulled that thread out completely. Ta-da! Bad stitching is gone. I can start over again. Only sewing about half of it. I didn't resew the entire thing, I just sewed from one seam to the other seam. Again, still fighting to make sure that one edge was not curling. I did eventually, when I sewed the waistband, realize that I need to pin this. So that worked out. I stretched it as needed that time. And it's time to turn it inside out and then line the tops up before sewing on the waistband. And also, I decided to make sure that the seam allowance at the waistband would be going the same direction it was going when I sewed it to the bottom, which is probably something fiddly that I didn't need to worry about, but I like knowing my seam allowances are all going the same direction from wherever they get intersected with. Again, I don't know if that makes sense, but I like seams to be flat. And because, you know, normally I top stitch everything, and I'm not doing that with this project. So I pinned the side seams together, lining to shell, wrong sides together. And then I found the centers of the front and back and pinned those, and pinned a lot between those as well to get that roll to stop rolling. And now I'm doing the waistband. I'm making a little tiny snip to show me where the center is. Sewing from one edge. Oh, I need to straighten my stitch. Sewing from one edge to just past that center stitch, then back stitching, and then skipping to about 5/8 inch from the other edge and sewing that. This will leave a hole that I can use to insert the elastic. And I also realized at this point that I didn't cut my waistband super straight, and I really should have recut it, but at this point I was just kind of wanting to be done with the project, so I didn't do that. Alright, back to zigzag. And now I will find the opposite edge from the seam I just sewed, and then mark that, and then fold it again out so I can mark the centers from back. I like to put the seams on waistbands aligned with the side seam instead of in the center back. The center back is the logical place to put it, but I feel like the side seams is the more innocuous place to put it. Okay, now I have pinned it to all the corresponding places of the skirt, and I'm zigzagging them all together. And now I am serging the edges, not because I need to. As you've probably gathered, you do not need a serger to sew knits. I'm serging it just because I like the finished appearance. And as I was going to say a moment ago, I really prefer to do these voiceovers in one take. I know I can edit, but I don't want to, so that's why they're a little rough. Okay, elastic time. Got a heavy safety pin. I do have a bodkin, but I don't use it. I generally fall back to safety pins. And I fold the ends of the elastic over themselves so they make sort of a point. I don't know if this really helps, but I just like to do it. I also like to pin the other end of the elastic with a smaller safety pin to some part of the item I am inserting the elastic into, so it doesn't accidentally get pulled inside the elastic channel. I don't know if this is a real danger. I just feel like it would be really annoying to fish it back out if it happens, so I always do this just so it doesn't happen. And then here we go, inserting the elastic. This is a very wide casing for the elastic. I tend to have a problem with making my elastic casings super narrow, and then it gets super annoying to thread the elastic through them. But because this is so wide, the elastic insertion is going real fast and easy. Okay, and now I am pulling the elastic out at the other side with enough slack that I will be able to get it through the sewing machine. And taking the pin out of the side that I had anchored and placed so it wouldn't get slurped into the casing, and I will be pulling that out, also enough to give it slack that I can sew it to the other end. I don't know how much I overlap them. It's like an inch and a half. I've never been too exacting about this. I figure out the waist elastic length by just pulling it snugly around my waist and then noting what length that is and just hoping I remember it correctly each time because I cut it at the same length that I think I should. Again, my sewing is probably a lot more slapdash than you realize. So I sew near both ends, thoroughly back tacking to make sure it's secure, and then I cut off all the little tiny threads between where I moved it from end to end that no one will ever see, but I know they're there. Well, I know they're not there after I cut them. Get that sewn bit shoved back into the elastic casing channel. Pull it a few times to make sure things are roughly distributed, and this hole here I technically should stitch up, but I don't, because now I'm done. It's done. Is it perfect? Of course not. Does that matter? The answer is also, of course not. It's fun, and that's what I was going for, so it's fine. Again, this was just more of a silly video compared to the previous sewing video. You don't have to sew at one level all the time. You can try the wild stuff, and then you can go back to the simple stuff. And what you learn and just get used to from both will help you with the other two. I mean, I did not set out to be good at sewing. I'm pretty good at sewing just because I've sewed so much, and that's what, if anyone gets anything out of any of the videos I make, it's that just sew. If you get good, you get good. If you don't, as long as you're having fun and feel happy with what you make, that's the goal. So thanks again for watching this a little less involved Unwise Sewing adventure, but it probably won't be the last. We'll see. Thanks for watching.